Vanilla WoW is one of the most beloved versions of World of Warcraft, and it has pretty much been mined for content for the past 2 decades to flesh out retail's expansion. From the Burning Crusade to Wrath of the Lich King to Cataclysm, and pretty much every expansion after that, it has been finishing off the OG storylines and story beats. So let's take a deep look into some of these OG storylines back how they were meant to be in vanilla. And in this particular case, we're going to discuss 5 raids that ended up becoming different things in future expansions. Actually, this very first one was completely scrapped and never really utilized. And that is the Stormwind Vault. Actually, that's a mild lie. The Stormwind Vault was eventually turned into the Violet Hold, a Dalaran themed dungeon, but it pretty much copied the OG story beats of what Stormwind Vault was meant to be, scaled it down a lot, and then made it into the Violet Hold dungeon. But let's discuss the OG Stormwind Vault. What exactly was it meant to be? And why did the devs choose to scrap it? Now, initially, the vault was meant to be a larger version of the Stockade. It was meant to house more dangerous and violent creatures in comparison to the Stockades. It was meant to be larger, bigger, more terrifying, and much more dangerous. Now, one of the reasons the devs have stated for cutting Stormwind Vault was because it was a bit too ambitious for the vanilla time frame. They ended up running out of time to really complete it and give it the love it deserved, and they wanted to focus more on outdoor content and raids and locations outside of cities, because they didn't want to make city-based content that was isolated or limited to a faction. Now, I don't know how much I necessarily believe that it didn't really fit with the game. They could have made a teleporter for the Horde, or a Horde version of the exact same dungeon. Would have been different assets, but the dungeon and raid would have played out exactly the same way. But again, in vanilla, there was so much scrap content that it makes sense that the devs just ran out of time. But some of the creatures that were meant to be ended up getting placed in future editions of the game, for example, Cataclysm and onward. For example, the Tol Barad raid as well is also somewhat a copy and change of the Stormwind Vault raid. I don't know exactly what kind of demons, monsters, orcs, or whatnot were kept imprisoned down here. Those ideas are pretty much lost to time, and any idea that the developers originally had is left in some scrap notebooks or in the heads of some people that clearly remember their original intentions and design concepts. But in my opinion, based off the Tol Barad raid as well as the Violet Hold, I expect this to have had some kind of big, monstrous demon creature still in the middle, corrupted nobles or people imprisoned by Onyxia because she was Lady Katrana Presta, put people in jail. You know, there would have been a whole storylines of freeing the falsely imprisoned individuals, getting their help, overthrowing Lady Katrana Presta, the whole shebang. There's so many ways they could have combined it into the overarching human storyline. Now, I personally think that Stormwind Vault should make some form of comeback in some kind of context. The asset's already there, Stormwind Vault is already finished, and multiple private servers have already completely fleshed out and filled out this raid concept. It wouldn't be, or I should clarify, it shouldn't be that difficult to flesh it out with unique assets, especially now that the Classic dev team has access to the art team. But this isn't a Classic Plus video, I make plenty of them as is. So we're gonna move on to the next scrapped raid, and that is the Amberhorn Caverns. Now, most of you have probably never actually heard the name Amberhorn Cavern, but most of you have heard of Hyjal. Now, Hyjal is not just a raid, it's a whole ass zone. It's large, it's amazing, all quotation marks, should be amazing if done properly, but it was fully fleshed out and there was a ginormous corpse of Archimonde at the center underneath Nordrassil. Hyjal, as we know in vanilla, was completely scrapped and essentially completely redone in Cataclysm. They also did utilize some of the original ideas and plans in TBC, with the TBC raid for the Siege of Hyjal, but that was merely an adaptation of the OG ideas for Hyjal. So what exactly was Hyjal meant to be, or in this context, what was the Amberhorn Cavern meant to be? Now, I've essentially gone through as many notes and files and dev interviews and just random dev blogs and Twitch streams from several devs who have talked about the ancient past of vanilla. And according to most people, the Amberhorn Caverns, or the concept of the Amberhorn Caverns, was essentially some kind of barrow den. It was meant to be similar to Illidan's prison in context. Now, I'm not sure if Illidan's prison and the Amberhorn Cavern was meant to be the same raid location dungeon, but those ideas are very old. So, the Amberhorn Cavern, like I said, some form of barrow den. It was meant to be underneath Hyjal. There was meant to be demons in there. There was meant to be wardens in there, ancient, slumbering, corrupted druids and such, as well as old god themes and remnants of the Night Elf Empire. Now, again, completely scrapped and was never brought back. Well, to a degree, In Legion, we did get Surama and some remnants of that ancient Night Elf Empire, but Amberhorn Cavern was meant to be a more ruined version of that essentially. Deep underneath Kalimdor, the remnants of a dark, mysterious, bloody path and future of the Night Elves. Now, I personally kind of prefer the idea of Amberhorn Caverns and the OG vanilla storyline over what happened in TBC and onwards. The devs have said that they were very ambitious in their original plans for Hyjal and what they wanted to do. Amberhorn Cavern has very little information left about it, so anything I say or anything you find online is essentially, oh, it was meant to be a raid of some sort, but we just ran out of time. But I'm curious into what the OG idea and intentions were for this original version. Sadly, we'll never know, but perhaps in the future, again, not a Classic Plus video, they may revisit and finish some of these original ideas because Chris Metzen is back and maybe he still has his OG notes for Kalimdor and what the plans for Hyjal was. So who knows, maybe those notes still exist. Moving on from the Amberhorn Caverns, which was a theoretical concept that got completely abandoned, let's move on to something that got very heavily reused, and that is Karazhan. Now, Karazhan's original intention was much grander than anybody really realizes. It was meant to have two levels, Upper Karazhan Tower and Lower Karazhan Tower. But on top of that, we have Karazhan Crypts. So these three locations were all meant to be interconnected to some degree. Now, we have some images of OG Karazhan, what it was meant to look like, and as you guys can see, for the most part, it's just excessive. So many layers, so many floors, there would be way too many bosses, just like BRD was drastically too big to be a dungeon and they essentially cut half of it in Cataclysm. The same thing essentially happened with Karazhan Tower's complete idea. They ended up trimming it down more and more and more, and by the time TBC came around, what we had left was just a 10-man raid because the original idea was just way too much resource intensive. So let's discuss some of these OG ideas for Karazhan. And some of the designers have said previously that Karazhan was meant to have multiple bosses, way more than we actually got, as well as having multiple levels that even connected to other dimensions and realms that Medivh had traversed and studied. Now, this is a small glimpse into what could have been because I'm not exactly sure what the story beats would have been. What kind of dimensions would have been accessing? Would these have been demon realms or things of that nature? Would they have been magical, unique little pockets of reality that were just different? And for those of you that have read John Statz's book about the design of vanilla World of Warcraft, you completely understand just how ambitious Karazhan Crypts were, as well as Karazhan Tower proper. Now, I hope someday the devs release a full-on video or maybe a World of Warcraft deep dive where they explain some of these OG ideas in detail, because the Karazhan we got is a fraction of what it was originally meant to be. Now, again, beating a dead horse, and I've said this after every single point so far, but in Classic Plus, finishing off these ideas would be a very interesting and innovative way to bring that vanilla world more and more life. Again, not a Classic Plus video. So let's move on to the next topic. Now, before I talk about Uldum in Classic and Vanilla, I do want to clarify one thing. The Uldum we got in Cataclysm was also a scrap version of a secondary Uldum. The Uldum we got in Cataclysm was essentially an Indiana Jones-esque bullshittery. But before I deep dive the vanilla storyline, let's talk about the original Cataclysm storyline. In Cataclysm, the Taurens and stuff were meant to go into Uldum and discover images and statues and things based off the Tauren goddesses and Tauren gods. Now, these would have included the Sunwalkers, which would have helped Taurens unlock their paladin storyline and belief. Now, I'm not sure about all the exact storylines, but you can look on Twitter, you can find them on forums and whatnot, that the OG storyline was much darker, much more hopeful at the same time, and expanded upon the Tauren lore in a way that was genuinely necessary. The Taurens, much like the Trolls, are the red-headed stepchild of the World of Warcraft universe, and they keep getting their lore butchered for no reason other than someone else has to shine right now, so you have to suffer so they shine. Now that we know that Uldum has two scrap storylines, let's go back to vanilla Uldum and what it was meant to be. Now, based on some OG data and information and dev interviews we found about Uldum's original design, it was meant to be an underground city, not above ground zone. So it was meant to be this big Titan facility that was meant to be kind of split up into multiple locations, a raid, a dungeon or two, an area you can actually explore. You're meant to open the gates to Uldum and go downstairs. Much like how Ahn'Qiraj is an open world location, but there's nothing in there. So even if you manage to glitch yourself into Ahn'Qiraj, it's just a completely empty location. Unless you go through the portal, in which case it turns into a raid. Uldum was meant to be the same. Now, the OG Uldum was scrapped pretty early on, they just did not have enough time. They started with both Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor's drawings and plans, but they didn't start developing Kalimdor until the Eastern Kingdom was finished. And that sucks a bit because a lot of the scrap story beats are from Kalimdor, not as much from Eastern Kingdoms. But essentially, imagine Uldaman scaled up to 10, a bigger version, because the Uldaman storyline essentially sends you to Uldum, and it's meant to unlock and begin the Uldum story arc. They may have intended to introduce this as a patch later on, but the devs have essentially said that they spent close to a decade working on Uldum before they finally managed to get the version we got in Cataclysm. So perhaps in another timeline, another reality, we would have gotten a different version of Uldum earlier, but it just never happened. What kind of Uldum would you have liked to see? I'm actually curious. Did people like the Cataclysm version of Uldum? Now though, we are going to go onto a place that people have essentially been clamoring for so goddamn long, it's insane. And that is Grimbatol. Now, Grimbatol happened to become a thing in Cataclysm, but it was not done just as well. Because Grimbatol was essentially taken from being a little location, a big-ass tower with an underground chasm and location, into becoming a zone, the Twilight Highlands. And they took a lot of the Grimbatol story arcs and themes and spread it across the zone, the Bastion of Twilight, and all of those shenanigans. And it was honestly done a disservice. Grimbatol should have honestly been a giant Blackrock Mountain-esque location with multiple floors, multiple dungeons, multiple raids. It should have been this iconic masterpiece that it was meant to be. I'm not going to talk about Cataclysm because the Twilight Highlands and all those story beats in Cataclysm were actually really cool, and the devs did do a good job. Just Grimbatol being a single 5-person dungeon is honestly a mild point of embarrassment in my opinion. Now, let's talk about the OG Grimbatol as a raid. What was it meant to be? How was it meant to look? Now, in the vanilla setting, Grimbatol's lore and story is already very expansive. I'm not even going to talk about Xalatath and all that stuff that's been added back into it. But essentially in vanilla and the old lore, the dwarves had the Dwarven Empire fracture, civil war shenanigans happen, whole bunch of characters, A, B, C, yada yada yada. I'm very summarizing everything because the story of the Dwarven Wars is very long, and I don't want to do a 2-hour video on Dwarven lore right now. But essentially, the Dark Iron Dwarves end up sacking Grimbatol by usage of Dark Old God magics, which end up making Grimbatol inhospitable and inhabitable by every single person. So where do the Wildhammer Dwarves go? They go north and make Airy Peak. They make a whole new city and livelihood up north. But Grimbatol essentially gets abandoned. Then comes the Second War. So the Second War, the Orcs come down there, they find the Demon Soul, they capture Alexstrasza, they enslave the Red Dragonflight. Then that's why the Orcs have Red Dragons in Warcraft 2 and 3 and whatnot. But then, you know, the Orcs lose in the Second War, the Red Dragons are freed, Alexstrasza in her anger seals off Grimbatol, leaves it a locked off location, filled with a lot of dragons and orcs and the darkness, and just so many more story beats that just combining Grimbatol into what it was meant to really be would have essentially been a Blackrock Mountain-esque situation. A multifaceted, multi-instance, multi-storyline-esque mega location. Sadly, they ran out of time. And that is a recurring theme in vanilla WoW. They ran out of time and then they finished all this stuff in future expansion. But man, I wish we would have gotten a second Blackrock Mountain in the form of Grimbatol. I just wish the storylines were finished because I would love to know what the OG story beats were meant to be. But don't let me rant or I'll be here for way too long. We have one final thing to cover. Now, I already covered 5 raids and these raids all should have been in vanilla, but they sadly were not. But another thing that was meant to be in vanilla but just got scrapped was the Caverns of Time. Now, the Caverns of Time was meant to have a raid and it was meant to have multiple dungeons. We're not exactly sure what happened. I know a lot of developers actually hate Caverns of Time or it's done to the lore and story. So the Caverns of Time for the most part is rather mysterious in its original intentions. Now we did get it in TBC, but the OG intentions were drastically more different. The Black Morass dungeon may have actually been the Black Morass raid, where you were meant to group up together and fight recurring bosses. So it would be boss 1 gets summoned, boss 2, boss 3, boss 4, boss 5. Or there may have been another raid in the Caverns of Time location instead. I'm not exactly sure because no matter how much research I do, how many dev interviews I try to scrape, how many old forum posts and just YouTube videos I try to find, we don't actually know what the original raid idea in the Caverns of Time was meant to be. but there was meant to be a raid there, and I don't know what the original intention was. So let me know in the comments below what raid or dungeon you would love to see most in a Classic Plus or in a future expansion, for example, the War Within or Midnight. Vanilla World of Warcraft had so much cut content that there are dozens upon dozens of things that are just not finished in this amazing world. But there are probably things you haven't even heard about that were cut from the game and make the world drastically more interesting if they were ever to be added back. But before I list these amazing ideas, let's talk about some of the things that people already know about. For example, Hyjal, Karazhan Tower being finished, Grim Batol, and things of that nature. All really cool things, but things that you have heard of before. But did you know that Vanilla WoW was originally meant to be up to level 70? That's not something you've probably heard of before. Now, before I dive too much into that, I should probably clarify why it was meant to be up to level 70. When WoW was first being made, it was a drastically bigger game, and the desires and visions for vanilla were a lot higher. They had pretty lofty goals that just reached for the heavens, and they had to scrap so much of it because there was just nowhere near enough time to make all of it. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft were being developed at the same time. WoW's development started in 1999, in fact a little bit earlier than that as well. So they had all these plans and ambitions, and the storylines and the plot points and so many things were just changed and evolved in ways that make World of Warcraft what they are today. But World of Warcraft being level 70 was just one of the few ideas that got cut. And it wasn't even the biggest change. That was very early on in World of Warcraft's development. But instead of talking about a concept, now let's move on to an idea that got cut from the game, and that is the Dark Iron Highway. Now, Blackrock Depths and the Blackrock Mountain was a ginormous location that took about 7 months to be brought to fruition. And that was 7 months of non-stop dedicated work by all the designers and developers. But Blackrock Depths was just meant to be bigger and bigger than it actually was. Now, in vanilla, just before it was launched, they only had about 4 years, about 5-ish total, to finish this entire world. And they didn't have enough time to put all the things they wanted in Blackrock Mountain into the game. And that brings us to the Blackrock Mountain's mysterious Dark Iron Highway. Now, the Dark Iron Highway is this continental highway system that was initially meant to connect all the Dwarven empires together, so Ironforge all the way to Grim Batol. Now, this is all very early lore, and most of it was cut. It's not canon, it hasn't been canon in a long time. But this is a talk about vanilla ideas that were cut, not the current canon. And the lore behind it is actually really interesting. Now, if you don't know, Emperor Thracian and the Dark Iron Dwarves summoned Ragnaros to stop the Ironforged Dwarves and the Wildhammer Dwarves from defeating them. And in this case, the Dark Irons were the aggressors. They lost, pulled the ultimate gotcha moment, and then lost even harder when Ragnaros leveled everything and created the Blackrock Mountain Burning Steps area that you know in the current lore. But that's just pieces of the lore that all connect to this mysterious ancient Dwarven empire, all these amazing things. And in this case, in a Vanilla Plus or a Classic Plus or whatever you want to call it, they should revisit this and expand upon the Dark Iron Highway. I want to know what plans they had cooking. Go into Metzen's notes, because they still have them apparently, and find what his original visions and ideas were, and finish them. Or at least let us know. Because what is behind Baelgar in the Dark Iron Highway? But don't let me drag on about the Dark Iron Highway, I'll spend hours talking about that. So let's move on to the next thing you didn't know about. Zuldar and Tol Barad, two islands that have significance from Warcraft 2, have some plot points in Warcraft 3, but we didn't actually see about them again until Cataclysm for Tol Barad, and actually never again for Zuldar. Now, these islands are right there inside World of Warcraft. If you look at all these old maps, you can see where they were. In fact, Zuldar was a staging point that the Orcish Horde used in the Second War to launch a lot of invasions, battle tactics, and it let them attack northern eastern kingdoms. And it was meant to be in the game. They even thought the design process, the OG maps, all the lore plot points that they had pointed to Zuldar being in game. But they never even started the development of it. And it makes me wonder what reason they had for scrapping Zuldar, because they began the Isle of Dr. Lepidus and a few other islands in game, which are already in game right now. You can even access them, they're just locked. But they never started Zuldar. And I don't know what the main reason it was for the devs to remove this process and remove this island from being developed. It had a lot of key integral features that are just relevant to the lore at the time. Not so much anymore because the world has changed again. The in-game canon and the modern canon is drastically different to Vanilla's canon. But moving on from Zuldar, we're going to touch more upon Tol Barad. Now, Tol Barad was brought into the lore in Cataclysm, and they did expand upon the Kultirans in Battle for Azeroth, but the OG Tol Barad and the OG Kultiras lore was different. Admiral Proudmoore, Jaina, all those storylines and plot points, they changed over time. The OG Tol Barad would have been an interesting location. It would have had Kultirans in game, added that faction, maybe even a reputation. I don't know what the plot points were for Vanilla, because all the things you can find about OG Vanilla are just scraps of information here or there, a dev leaking something by accident, or a dev just going into an interview or just talking about it on their Twitch streams or on Twitter just randomly on a whim. And to be fair, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if most of the original writers forgot what their plot points were. So we have to guess and correlate based on information they left in game or their notes and things they've said online. Now, if you remember, earlier on I said that Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft began development at about the same time. Now, this is something that may really surprise you, but Jaina was meant to be the original Banshee Queen, not Sylvanas. Sylvanas was a throwaway character that wasn't relevant to the Frozen Throne. And the Frozen Throne DLC essentially made her a more important character and added her story arc. But if you look at Warcraft 3's original voice lines, you can hear Jaina dying, you can hear her torment, her pain. Again, a scrap story beat. But imagine how different the story and the world would be if they chose to go with that OG storyline of Jaina becoming the Banshee Queen, and how much different Azeroth and Lordaeron would be. And story-wise, it would have made more sense as well. Jaina leading the Forsaken has much more impact and power to the story than Sylvanas does. A High Elf leading the Forsaken is drastically different than Jaina, Arthas's love interest, and her opponent in the Scourge vs. the Forsaken game. It's an amazing plot beat, but this is alternate timeline scenarios because we can't go back and change the lore that much. At this point, everyone loves Sylvanas, controversial take, and people love Jaina, controversial take. So they can't change this, but it is an interesting scrapped idea on the OG old lore that developed into what it is in the modern day. But talking about another thing that changed because of Warcraft 3 and WoW are hero classes. That's right, hero classes were meant to be in World of Warcraft. The reason they're not, they ran out of time and money. That's the main reason. There was no grand conspiracy. They had a timeline they had to meet, and they could not meet it if they were going to make hero classes. That's why certain classes in vanilla feel so terrible. They weren't meant to be in that state. They were meant to be finished and expanded upon. For example, warlocks having metamorphosis and things of that nature were designed and planned. Blade Master from Warcraft, Mountain King from Warcraft, all of those specs, those hero specs were meant to come into WoW. But money, timelines, deadlines made it so that we never got hero classes. But it's also mildly sad that we're still using OG vanilla ideas in retail to this day. And talking about classes, did you guys know that in the original plan for World of Warcraft, there was no rogues and druids were not part of the plan? Instead, we had assassins and rune masters. Now, rune masters ended up becoming death knights in Wrath of the Lich King. The whole concept and plan for it turned into death knights, all the runes that they use. But assassins turned into, and then they added druids instead of rune masters, and that's the vanilla classes that we have. Now, rune masters were an interesting class. The design philosophy behind it was interesting, but they never really fleshed it out. They put it to the side because they couldn't figure out a way to put it into the lore. Now, why did they turn into Death Knights? Because the original Death Knight hero class just didn't make sense, and they took Rune Master's skill set and made that Death Knights instead. But imagine if they added Rune Masters to Vanilla WoW, or Classic Plus in this case. How interesting and how different would the lore and the story and the classes be in modern WoW today if Rune Masters had stayed in game? But talking about the OG classes, Assassin turning into Rogue is not a real big difference. It's essentially the same thing, just a different name. I'm sure the Assassin skill set and talents and abilities might have been mildly different, but Rogue and Assassin is the same thing. There's nothing really major there to change or worry about. I'm going to talk about a topic that some people have heard about, but not everybody has, and that is the Caverns of Time. The Caverns of Time was initially slated for vanilla. It was meant to be in-game. In fact, the Black Morass dungeon is fully finished. The doodads are a bit wonky, so it doesn't work correctly. But the whole Black Morass dungeon instance was designed for vanilla WoW. It was part of the original 30 dungeons they had planned for vanilla. That's another topic I'm going to cover later in the video. And the reason the Caverns of Time is locked in vanilla is because they couldn't get the doodads and the timeline and the stories to work, mainly because Warcraft 3 took so long to develop and there were several delays in the development of Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft. So they had to scrap a lot of the Caverns of Time ideas and push them forward to TBC and onwards, as they did finish them off later in time. But not just Black Morass, Durnhold Keep and a few other dungeon designs in TBC were all vanilla slated content. Now again, the devs, much like most other things on this list and video you're listening to right now, didn't have the time to finish or the manpower or the money because the budget was limited and they had so many projects they were working on. But Caverns of Time being a vanilla would have been a huge difference into the gameplay and the story loop that we'd be experiencing. They may have ended up expanding on the Caverns of Time much more if it was an OG vanilla system. And then moving on to the next point, 30 dungeons and much more raids than we actually got were slated for vanilla. Now, you guys have to realize that the initial world map that they drew was drastically different to the world map that we ended up with. Kalimdor was a bit wonky, there were way more land masses, so many more islands, but budget and timeline. I've said that several times in this video, but that's the main reason a lot of these vanilla ideas never came to fruition. Now, these 30 dungeons, I did name a few of them already. Karazhan had a dungeon component, there were more BRD dungeons slated, Caverns of Time and Black Morass. But some others you may never have heard about are the Evacuation Site, a Dwarven dungeon, Grim Batol, which was meant to be a dungeon and a raid, Ashenvale Ruins was a dungeon that was meant to be in-game, Skullrock for the Horde, or the Orcs in this case, which I think turned into Ragefire Chasm, but I can neither confirm nor deny that, I'm not actually sure. The Silithid Hive, which I think was split into multiple dungeons, which then got turned into AQ20. Again, I can neither confirm nor deny exactly what happened to the Silithid Hive concept. And then Ajaro is meant to have a dungeon, but some people think it's a raid, and I'm not sure exactly. A lot of the dev notes and dev images are very blurry, hard to actually read, and they're just images that are over 20 years old, so the quality of these images is really hard to decipher. Again, there are more concepts that were initially included, scrapped, reworked, and became different dungeons. But I'm going to list a few more that you may never have heard about. The Abandoned Tauren Dungeon, the Talon Dungeon in Stone Talon Mountains. Yes, they had a dungeon plan there, never really came to fruition. Tol Barad, the Siege of Airy Peak, the Dragon Moor had a dungeon tied with them, the Diamond Mines in STV. Not sure exactly what that dungeon / raid was meant to be, but it was part of the original concepts. And I'm just gonna stop right there because I could theorycraft on every single one of these original abandoned ideas, but this video would be 5 hours long. But let me know in the comments if you want a 5-hour long video where I break down every abandoned OG idea and what it would look like in the modern day, for example in Classic Plus or retail. Now, there are two things I have left to cover. The first one of those two is the Dark Portal. Now, if some of you remember playing Warcraft 3, you guys will recall there being multiple Dark Portals in one of the Outland missions. And in fact, in OG Vanilla's Alpha, or Pre-Alpha as they'd call it, there were actually multiple Dark Portal entrances which led to the Outlands, or multiple different dungeons in these locations. These portals were meant to open to different parts of destroyed Outland, and they were meant to be dungeons. Again, a scrapped idea that never really came around to finishing it because the story in Warcraft 3 changed, Illidan ended up destroying a lot of these dark portals, yada yada yada. But the OG dark portal was actually in Teldrassil, and then they moved the dark portal from there to Azshara, and then they decided that it didn't really fit Azshara, but it was meant to be an underwater dark portal entrance which took you to a demon realm of some sort, and you were meant to fight a few bosses in there, maybe it might have been a raid instead. And then they decided that this doesn't really work for what we're trying to do. Again, budget and timing. So they moved it to the Blasted Lands because the Blasted Lands had nothing going for it. So they made Blasted Lands the location they put the Dark Portal in. Now, I wonder how the world and lore and story would be if they kept that OG idea of there being multiple Dark Portals. Like, how exactly would the story have changed when they made Outland and TBC? Would there have been 3 or 4 entrances to Outland? Would they have kept it that these were different locations? Maybe they would have expanded upon these OG vanilla dungeons or raids that they were there, and you could visit them from TBC as well. But again, never came to fruition. But for Classic Plus, I actually kind of hope they go back to it and add more Dark Portals and kind of follow the storyline of OG Vanilla or Alpha Vanilla. I want to see what the devs can cook by finishing off these story beats. And now for the 10th and final scrapped vanilla content you may have never heard about. Goblins were meant to be a playable race in vanilla. Gnomes and trolls and goblins were meant to be 3 extra races added to be playable races for the player base. Now, everybody knows about gnomes and trolls, you can play them both. But gnomes never made it. In fact, until Cataclysm, they were not a playable race. And I don't know what the reason for cancelling that was. Was the main reason because they didn't want to add a neutral race and they couldn't figure out how to do it? Or was there meant to be an extra alliance race that was scrapped as well? Where Worgen, for example, meant to be a race alongside goblins. This is very early pre-conceptual things. This was before the world was even finished being properly designed, which made at some point in the development pipeline, they decided that, screw it. We can't add goblins because Worgens don't work correctly, so no Worgens and no goblins. And then guess what happens in Cataclysm? Worgens and goblins. So based off of everything I've told you guys, there was meant to be more races, more classes, more specs, more zones, more dungeons, more raids, just more locations overall that we never got to see. But the developers took on and finished in later expansions and later seasons. And honestly, with Classic Plus being on the horizon, the dev team should go back and finish OG Vanilla and the OG intentions. For example, in the Caverns of Time, add a timeline where Jaina becomes the Banshee Queen. Because why not? It was part of the OG plans that got scrapped. And I would honestly love to see some of this come to fruition and be engaging, interesting content in the future. Vanilla WoW was meant to have 30 dungeons, and 6 of those were meant to be beginner dungeons. That's right, the vanilla WoW you know launched with 20 dungeons. That's quite a lot, but there was meant to be much more. We're going to deep dive all those intricate little abandoned concepts that never made it to vanilla and never even made it to alpha or beta. Now, there are 8 races in World of Warcraft, but at the time when all the stuff was being conceptualized, there were only 6 races. Trolls and gnomes were added later on. They weren't meant to be part of the playable OG races for vanilla WoW. They did of course make it in alpha and well before these dungeons were scrapped. So if they were designed at the time, we likely would have still only had 6 beginner dungeons because the trolls and gnomes shared the starting zones with orcs and dwarves. But let's list off the 6 beginner dungeons. We have the gold mine for humans. We have the excavation site for dwarves. We have Ashenvale Ruins for the Night Elf. We have the monastery for the Forsaken, at the time known as the Scourge. We have Skull Rock for the orcs, and then we have Razorfen for the Tauren. And now some of those dungeons you heard eventually morphed into and became other well-known dungeons that we know in the current modern day and age. For example, Monastery became Scarlet Monastery and was split into Shadowfang Keep at the same time. Whereas we have Skull Rock, which very likely became Ragefire Chasm. Now, that's not a confirmation, but it's essentially around the same location, so it does make sense. And Ashenvale Ruins became Black Fathom Deeps. But as I said at the very beginning, a lot of these concepts changed and shifted and became completely different or alien things to the original intention. For example, with the Forsaken, at the time they were simply called the Scourge, and they had Monastery. There was no Shadowfang Keep, and Cathedral, which became Scarlet Cathedral and Scarlet Monastery, was its own separate instance. Now, the Monastery was likely meant to be a Scarlet Monastery, and the Scarlet Cathedral was very likely meant to be a raid, and both were meant to be separate locations. We had Monastery shift into a completely different idea, and I'll go into more detail on that later on. Now, they cancelled these 30 dungeons because Vanilla WoW's whole goal was to make too much content, and they just kept making content until they ran out of time. So of these 30 dungeons, most of them never saw the light of day, and most of them were scrapped and different dungeons or different ideas took their place. We're discussing the 6 starter dungeons which were scrapped, as well as a few mid-level dungeons. I'm not going to dive into the mid-level dungeons too much, but I do want to touch on them because it does tie into the starter dungeons. Now, another thing to consider is that dungeons were originally meant to be open world. That's right, the dungeons that we have today, the instance dungeons, were not part of pre-alpha conceptualization. The reason we have instance dungeons is actually because the world kept changing. So when they made a location and they put doodads down, the design team would end up expanding the zone, expanding the world, and that dungeon and every single doodad would have to move. But guess what? there was no select all button. So you had to individually move every single doodad. And on top of that, the doodad tool was broken. So when they put a doodad down, it went to the ceiling of the dungeon and they had to manually drag it around into position. So making a dungeon was a nightmare. And then the devs, the developers, the art team, everybody got together, nobody agreed, and somebody created a new and unique way of instancing off a dungeon so that you did not have to move every single art asset and doodad after it was placed. So in this original world, all 6 of these starter dungeons were meant to be open world locations. In fact, every single dungeon was meant to be an open world location. But that got scrapped and we got dungeons, and that became the future of essentially World of Warcraft as we know it. But we are going to start with the Eastern Kingdoms because that was the continent that was finished first. They started with the Eastern Kingdoms and then rushed Kalimdor. Now, I need to make one final clarification. I apologize, we're going to start soon. But essentially everything I say, you may find traces of it within World of Warcraft currently, whether it was scrapped, changed, or readapted. Now, the reason for that is World of Warcraft and Warcraft 3 were being designed side by side. Warcraft 3 was much further ahead, and World of Warcraft's Team 2 started slightly after the fact. So certain things ended up changing, being developed and redeveloped and moved and removed because they had to adapt based off the world Chris Metzen was building in Warcraft 3, and then they had to go and fix it in World of Warcraft. Now then, let's just dive right into it. The Gold Mine, the human starting dungeon. Many of you may not know this, but every single Alliance player for the most part has actually played in and enjoyed the very first dungeon for all of the Alliance, and that is Fargo Deep Mine in Elwyn Forest. It was meant to be a dungeon, and to a degree it still technically is. Now, you don't really go in there multiple times to kill Goldtooth or bosses or things of that nature, because it was scaled down to become a zone inside of a zone. It was a little quest hub. You go in there, collect your candles, kill the kobolds, kill Goldtooth, things of that nature. It's also a location where most people experience their first death, because as an Alliance player, you go in there overconfident, get run over by kobolds, and you die. Your candle snuffed out. Let's talk about Fargo Deep Mine, or the Gold Mine, about how it was initially meant to be, which was a dungeon. Multifaceted, multiple bosses, multiple locations and instances. Now we can see in game that they clearly stopped putting that much effort into it, and they put a lot more effort into places like the Dead Mines or other areas after the fact, because again, they realized that they could not redo the Gold Mine because the world kept changing. And instead of re-instancing and redesigning it, they just moved on. Now that's not factual, but that's what I assume happened with the Gold Mine, because they clearly scrapped these original 6 starter dungeon ideas and moved on to other bigger dungeons. But let's discuss the next one, the Dwarves, the excavation site. Now, the excavation site, at least based off what I can tell, is meant to be inside of Loch Modan. It's essentially what we know as Ironband's excavation site. Now, that's not factual, but I think the original concept of the excavation site just became a little quest hub inside of Loch Modan. Now, if you look at the OG map of Vanilla when it was being developed or pre-development in pre-alpha, you could see that Dun Moreau and Loch Modan and Grim Batol and the wetlands were much smaller, because in the original design, the Dwarven territories were a very thin strip of Eastern Kingdoms. That ginormous Dun Moreau that we have in Vanilla wasn't part of the plan when they were designing all of this stuff initially. In fact, take a look at this pre-vanilla, pre-alpha development map, and take a look at this Warcraft 2 map right here, and you can see when put side by side, you can see what their intentions were. Now, the Dwarven excavation site was clearly meant to tie into Uldaman and then into Grim Batol and all those Dwarven shenanigans about exploring and uncovering the mysteries of Azeroth, and then eventually into Uldum and whatnot. Now, a lot of those story beats and plot points got stopped in half or just abandoned, but that was the original intention behind the Dwarf starting dungeon. Now, was Ironband's excavation site the dungeon idea? Probably not exactly one for one, but that's the closest thing I can find that may have been the excavation site that the dwarves were meant to have as the starting dungeon. So now we have the monastery, and as we know it, and as I said, it was split into Shadowfang Keep and the Scarlet Crusade, or the Scarlet Monastery. But initially, we had the cathedral, the Scarlet Cathedral, its own separate thing, and then we had the Scarlet Monastery as the leveling zone, the leveling dungeon for the Forsaken. Now, at the time when they were developing all this stuff, again, like I said, they were doing all of this at the same time as Warcraft 3 and the Frozen Throne, and the Forsaken were called the Scourge. They were not called the Forsaken as of yet. And I don't know if the Forsaken story beats had been written as of this moment. but don't quote me on that. It may have meant to be called the Scourge from the very beginning and the Forsaken came about later. I'm not sure what the original plans were. Keep in mind, this shit was written in 1999, if not early 2000s, maybe even before that. Nonetheless, they ended up merging the monastery and the cathedral into one instance, the Scarlet Monastery, and then they recreated the Shadowfang Keep down south inside of its own zone in Silverpine Forest. So it makes me wonder what the difference between the cathedral and the monastery were meant to be. Clearly one was going to be a raid or an endgame zone of a dungeon of some kind versus the level up dungeon. We never did get that cathedral. Cathedral and monastery merged into one. Or maybe Tyr's hand was meant to be the cathedral and ended up moving it later on, but then they ran out of time to make it a dungeon or a raid. There are so many parts of the vanilla and pre-vanilla and pre-alpha and all that stuff that just changed and shifted so many times that story beats are hard to track down and figure out in true detail. Now though, we are going to move on to Kalimdor. Beautiful, lovely Kalimdor. Now, Kalimdor was rushed because Eastern Kingdoms kept having problems and issues which kept making them delay things and rush things and just do things in a much faster manner because they were developing an MMO from scratch for the very first time. It's why Kalimdor seems a bit more rushed and where there's so many more kill quests versus the humans and the starting zones in the Eastern Kingdoms, because those were developed and they had time. For example, the quest line inside that 4 zones interconnected, letting you travel back and forth, sending letters. If you read those quests, they're very interesting, very juicy, very full and chock full of details. Whereas the Horde zones in the Kalimdor, just kill this, get me 10 of this, kill 20 of this, get 300 of this. They didn't have time to make detailed quest lines. In fact, Kalimdor was given a much bigger design scope and size compared to its original intentions. If you look at the OG maps of Kalimdor, it was maybe 3/4 or half the size of the Eastern Kingdoms. Now, did they make it bigger so they could add more kill quests because it was simpler than designing close, tight-knit locations? Maybe. I don't exactly know why they made Kalimdor so much bigger than it actually is in their original plans. Nonetheless, we have Skull Rock, the Orc starting dungeon. Now, as I said, this may have turned into Ragefire Chasm, but it's kind of debatable. I'm not gonna lie to you guys. If you look at the OG map, Skull Rock was northeast of Orgrimmar, not inside Orgrimmar. So, does that mean that Durotar was both above and below Orgrimmar? Was Orgrimmar always meant to be at the very top of Durotar, connecting to Ashenvale and all that? We don't actually know. Again, like I said, this was all designed before the Warcraft 3 campaign, the bonus Orc campaign, even began. So, it does show us this mysterious alternate look at what these dungeons and locations were meant to be. Nonetheless, Skull Rock very likely did become Ragefire Chasm. It has that same theme, that same kind of naming scheme. So I'm just going to say, for the sake of this, that it did become Ragefire Chasm. But if it didn't, I expect it to still be some kind of demon dungeon, some orcs that rebelled, maybe some leftover demon orcs, things of that nature. But again, there's not much more information to go off of. That's all we really have. So we're going to move on to the Night Elves and the Ashenvale Ruins. Now, the Ashenvale Ruins were initially up north in where the Moonglade was meant to be. The initial plans, the Moonglade, Ashenvale, Darkshore, all was part of one ginormous zone based off the looks of the Warcraft 3 map. Now again, it's called the Ashenvale Ruins, but it's up where Moonguard was meant to be. And then in fact, if you look at the map of Warcraft 3, of Vanilla, it's essentially at a location called the Ruins of Mathistria. I do want to clarify, I said Moonguard, I meant the Moonglade, but I'm tired, it's midnight, and I'm recording this, so it is what it is. But like I said, they changed and shifted so much that locations kept changing, zones, map ideas where things should be, how zones should be placed, how the map should be spread out. So many things changed in Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms that the pre-alpha map versus the Warcraft 3 or the vanilla map are completely separate and different things. Nonetheless, Ashenvale Ruins became Blackfathom Deeps. That is a fact. That's not a maybe. That is actually what happened. In fact, in early vanilla, in early alpha, the Ruins of Mathistria little location took you to Blackfathom Deeps. They ended up moving the Blackfathom Deeps location from the Ruins of Mathistria down to Ashenvale later on. In fact, that old location in the Ruins of Mathistria is actually called Old Blackfathom Deeps locale. So we know for a fact that it used to be Blackfathom Deeps. Now, what made them move it from there to Ashenvale? I don't know. I don't know what the design process of that was. Maybe Black Fathom Deeps was meant to be like Ragefire Chasm, a level 9 to 15 dungeon, and then they chose to make it a level 20 plus dungeon later on. The plans and ideas of the OG devs is wild, and so much changed. And I said that so many times during this video, but it's true. We were meant to have 30 dungeons. In fact, we only got 20. And the devs themselves even considered 20 to be way more content than the player base needed. Vanilla WoW launched as an MMO with too much content. The first of its kind at the time, because most of the MMOs, you had to make your own content. You had to go and grind for it. Now, I'm not going to talk about the fact that maybe Ashenvale and Darkshore were meant to be one zone. I don't think they were. But again, the files and like images you can find from back then, it's kind of hard to decipher exactly what things were meant to be that early on in development. But the dungeon's location did change. But now we're going to discuss the Taurens, and that's right, they had their own dungeon. And it was a Wild West themed dungeon. I'm not sure if that meant like cowboys and shooting, but Wild West can mean many things. It might have meant more like Indians versus Indians in this case, because the Tauren are based off the natives of America, and the Razorfen Crawl and the Razorfen are based off the natives of America. I'm not exactly sure. And the Tauren starting dungeon was called Razorfen. Not Razorfen Downs, not Razorfen Crawl, Razorfen. Now, the Tauren dungeon clearly got scrapped and completely removed, and it was repurposed into Razorfen Downs and Razorfen Crawl in the future. But what was that OG dungeon meant to look like? In my personal opinion, I think the original Razorfen was meant to be the Razorfen, the Quillboar invading Mulgore, and it was meant to be this kind of standout between the Tauren trying to defend Mulgore, their homeland, versus the encroaching and invading Quillboar. Again, I'm just making shit up. I don't know what the initial idea for the OG Razorfen was meant to be. But it would have been interesting to see, because they had a lot of plans for OG vanilla World of Warcraft, and they scrapped so much of it that if they ever did finish it, if there was ever a Classic Plus with everything finished, it would be double the size of modern day vanilla, modern day classic. And that's insane to conceptualize. But that is all 6 starter dungeons. And yes, I went into a lot of detail about these dungeons and these locations, but I could have gone into so much more. But again, I don't want to make a 2-hour video about every nitty-gritty NPC, character name, location that's name changed and whatnot. But I did promise at the beginning of the video that I was going to touch onto some mid-level dungeons that got scrapped or were changed. But I'm only going to cover 2. The first is Grimbatol, and that's right, Grimbatol was meant to have a beginner level dungeon, around the level 20 to 30 mark. Now, I'm not sure exactly what that was meant to look like, because that's the same idea, for example, as Blackrock Mountain having a level 30 or 40 dungeon inside of it. It's an endgame zone, because Grimbatol clearly had the Dragon Maw and other endgame activities designed inside of it. So the fact that they put a lower level dungeon there as well is an interesting concept, and it would have been kind of cool to see. Imagine a level 30 having a little path from like Dun Morogh or something connecting to Grimbatol. Maybe that's what the original Dwarven Highway was meant to be. What's behind the gate from Baelgar? The dungeon that connects Grimbatol all the way to Dun Morogh. Or maybe it's not. But I am doing a whole ass video about the Dark Iron Highway and its mystery and what it was actually meant to be. But that's a 2-hour video, and it's giving me an aneurysm to finish. So that'll come in the future at some point as well. But the second thing I'm going to mention is the Talon. That's right, this is a location that was completely and utterly scrapped and never came back, period whatsoever. It was located in Stone Talon. In the northwestern edge of Stone Talon was a location called the Talon. Now, what even was that meant to be? I think it was meant to be some kind of harpy matriarch, harpy old god, but again, they never went into detail and they never ever came back to it. Even in Cataclysm and onwards, the Talon was never re-explored. It was essentially forgotten about for the most part. Now, there are a couple ruins and locations in Stone Talon that could be the Talon, but the whole concept behind the Talon was never finished, and it is a frustrating thing to me because I would love to know more about old Kalimdor, old Tauren lore, old Kalimdor lore, just old Azeroth in general, such an interesting and amazing place that I hope that devs someday do come back and explore the Talon in some capacity. Now, Stone Talon, like I said, was always meant to have more story, more connections, more depth to it. But Chris Metzen, based on an interview I've had with an old dev that worked at Blizzard, always liked to look forward, not back. And the quote he said was, Chris didn't even like to look at his old notes, he liked to write new ones. And so instead of looking back and finishing off a dungeon, if Chris couldn't think of a unique, original way to make something after he'd already written it the first time, he would just move on to another topic, another dungeon, another idea. He didn't really go back to finish his ideas. He would just take what his old ideas in his mind were and write newer plans, newer visions of them. And he's clearly an amazing guy considering he created the whole Warcraft universe as we know it, and we've been finishing off his old notes for the past 20 years in modern day retail. Realistically though, he probably just forgot about that talent and then just never looked back to remember it. And that's probably what actually happened to it. Imagine an Azeroth where Sylvanas doesn't exist. Controversial, but it may have actually happened. In Warcraft 3, when Sylvanas was killed, she was just a nameless general character. Well, her name was Sylvanas, but she wasn't important to the story. You as Arthas were meant to go through, kill her, end that part of the storyline, and keep on trekking forward. But what happens in Warcraft 3 The Frozen Throne makes Sylvanas an important character that changes the storyline. But the original story, the scrap story, actually has Sylvanas staying as an irrelevant character that just dies and is forgotten about, almost to the same degree as Garithos. Characters there, characters cool, some fan art here or there, character forgotten. Because in the OG scrap storyline, Jaina was meant to become the Banshee Queen, or the Lich Queen, depends on which direction they went with her. She was meant to lead the Forsaken and the Lordaeron faction remnants. That's right, it was a whole story arc that would have changed Warcraft's lore and universe irrecoverably so. The entire lore and universe that we know it as it is would be completely different. Now, I'm not going to try to imagine how different the story would be up to the modern day. I'm just going to talk about the Warcraft 3 story beats and the vanilla story beats, because anything after that is just too much stretching of fiction to really make this video work. Now, what do I mean by make this video work? I don't want to do a 10-hour alternate history video about all the different changes. This is gonna be a video where we talk about vanilla WoW if Jaina was the leader of the Forsaken and how many things that changes. So let's start off with a very obvious question. Why did they change it? Why did they make it so that Sylvanas became the Banshee Queen instead of Jaina? What made them choose that this story beat wasn't worth pursuing? Because it really makes a lot of sense. The storyline of Arthas becoming corrupted and unrecoverable versus Jaina becoming corrupted and becoming recoverable. She was meant to be a stark contrast against Arthas, this irredeemable villain who sacrificed everything to save what he loves and fails in the end, becoming the ultimate evil he swore to destroy. And then Jaina, who watched her love, the star of her life, become the shriveled, monstrous person who then revives her and brings her back. Her whole story beat, her whole story arc is becoming an antithesis to the Scourge, leading the Forsaken and saving Lordaeron. And now, while this might be a little cringy, I think her title and name would have been Jaina, the Lich Queen, versus Arthas, the Lich King. And whereas Arthas gets dropped from the Lich King because he becomes the Lich King, Jaina would have always been Jaina, the Lich Queen. Anyways, let's just start big. How does this change Lordaeron, and how does this change Northern Eastern Kingdoms as we know it? Well, from the very get-go, Jaina is not a monster. In Warcraft 3, The Frozen Throne, and in vanilla WoW, she's a loving, sweet individual who is trying her best in a fucked up world. And even if she did get resurrected, she would not have become a monster even if she was undead. So she'd likely be pro-human and pro-Forsaken and trying her best to combine these two factions. So what character does that bring to the foray that likely would have lived into vanilla? Lord Garithos. That's right, the man whose whole character personality was racism. For those of you that know the story and the lore, Garithos gets murdered by Sylvanas. She betrays him after charming him and making him help her. And then the whole thing happens. She murders all the humans, raises a whole bunch of corpses, helps make the Forsaken a stronger and more independent faction. But in this timeline, where it's Jaina that's running the Forsaken, she likely wouldn't have killed Garithos and the whole human faction behind him. Actually, she may have still killed Garithos if I'm being honest with everybody, but she wouldn't have indiscriminately murdered every human, every dwarf, every gnome that was backing Garithos' alliance. And like I said, just those two little beats there changes Northern Eastern Kingdoms beyond recovery. It changes vanilla. It changes WoW storyline beyond recovery. Imagine at Eastern Kingdoms where Garithos controls Silverpine, he controls Hillsbrad, parts of Alterac, and parts of Arathi. Now him and Jaina may have some contention between between those lands and who controls what. But Jaina's a neutral figure. She likely would have tried her best to stay in touch with the Alliance and with the Horde, because even in Warcraft 3, she befriends Thrall and helps the Horde. She even helps Thrall kill her own father to preserve the peace. So in this timeline, there's two alliances, just like there's two hordes. Now, if you guys know, there's the old horde and then there's the new horde, or in this case, the true horde and just the horde. The horde that you the players can play, and then Ren Blackhand's horde in Blackrock Mountain. In this timeline, there would be two alliances. You'd have the alliance run from Stormwind, and then you would have Garithos' alliance. Now, Garithos is a pretty evil, irredeemable, racist bastard, but he makes a good villain. Can you imagine a raid, the dungeons, the story arcs, the story beats of Garithos as being a villain in vanilla? The dude is a menace. It would be hilarious. It would be actually an interesting alternate timeline in which he's the main raid. He's the main dungeon bosses that we have to fight. We have to dismantle this false alliance that is keeping the war going and keeping the war hella racist. Because he hated dwarves, he hated gnomes, he hated elves, he hated everybody that wasn't a de facto human. So what else really changes in this storyline? Now, in this case, because Jaina is leading the Forsaken, does she join the Horde like the Forsaken of Sylvanas do in the OG timeline? Realistically, no. The Forsaken would have stayed a neutral faction because there would have been no real reason to join the Horde. Now, she may have still actually ended up joining the Horde, which would make the Alliance versus Horde situation extra interesting, because now the Alliance is fighting the Alliance and the Horde is fighting the Alliance because Garithos was racist. To be fair, that's not his main shtick. He's actually just an evil, irredeemable person, but calling him racist is funny. If Jaina joins the Horde, that changes the whole dynamic. She's a bridge between the Alliance and the Horde, because the Alliance in vanilla was kind of angry and upset with the Forsaken. They hated the undead. That's the main reason why Sylvanas joined the Horde. Not because she wanted to. There's no part of her that loves the Horde or the Trolls or the Tauren or the Orcs. She joined it because the humans hated the Forsaken. That was the main story reason. But would humanity have rejected Jaina? Would they have forced her to join the Horde? I honestly don't think so. I think it would have been a neutral faction in this case. And I know it does kind of break the vanilla storyline, the vanilla arc, because the Forsaken being part of the Horde is what makes the Horde the Horde. But this is an alternate timeline where they kept their original plans for Jaina being the Lich Queen. So the Forsaken would have been a neutral faction, and you could have had a Forsaken join either the Alliance or the Horde. And that would have also made, for example, gnomes or something else a neutral faction as well. Again, I'm not sure if they would have gone through with that, but it changes so many dynamics of the storyline that I'm curious what the plans would have been with World of Warcraft, because Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft were being developed at the same time. And I wonder if they scrapped that story beat just so it made sense in WoW itself. Did they keep Jaina alive because they didn't want to make the factions too imbalanced? Nonetheless, stopping the story right there. The world has changed so much that it's irrecoverable. It's completely different to those timelines that we know. Every single story beat going forward would have kept altering the lore and the story further and further. The events of TBC, the events of Wrath of the Lich King. Can you imagine Wrath of the Lich King where Jaina confronts Arthas, the Lich Queen stepping up to the Lich King, trying to use her powers to free Arthas from his corruption? There are so many things that would just make the stories wild, amazing, and just completely nutty that I'm going to end the video there and ask you all, how different do you think the world would be? What is behind this door? It's been sealed for over 2 decades, and we still don't know the mystery behind the Dark Iron Highway and what's standing behind the giant known as Baelgar. Now, this gate is as mysterious as the OG Grimbatol, but what was the intentions? What were the designs? What were the plans for the Dark Iron Highway and the mystery that it is? Now, Vanilla WoW is full of these. So many places, locations, lore, and storylines that started in Vanilla WoW or pre-alpha WoW, and then were either scrapped, removed, or just forgotten and abandoned. And it's one of the biggest things about Vanilla WoW that people wish were finished. All these amazing locations and the stories that they contain. And the biggest one is the Dark Iron Highway. Now, I'm gonna cover the theories people have, some conclusions that people have found from other locations, and the overall theme and belief behind and around the Blackrock Mountain area and the Dark Iron Dwarves. We have to give some lore and story context to Blackrock Mountain and why the dwarves built this massive underground underground city, why they're being controlled by Ragnaros, why Neltharion is inside, and why all those shenanigans are happening. Go back a long time ago, in a time long before Azeroth looked like Azeroth. The dwarves were ruled by the Anvilmar clan, one dynasty, one empire, the Wildhammer, the Dark Iron, and the Bronzebeard. Till High King Anvilmar had a heart attack, and then a civil war ensued, and the Dark Iron Dwarves said that we're the best, we deserve to rule everything, and then they lost, and they lost multiple times. And then long story short, the Dark Iron Dwarves led to Grimbatol becoming Grimbatol as it is because they ended up nuking it with the Void. The Wildhammer had to flee, yada yada yada. We get to where we are now. The Dark Iron Dwarves, in losing the war against the Bronzebeards, and then the Wildhammer decided we're going to summon and enslave an elemental, and they summoned Ragnaros, and then Ragnaros fucking blew up their city, and then they were forced to become essentially slaves to the Fire Lord himself. Now, I have to summarize that this is a very short summary of Dwarven lore. I skipped a lot of things just so this video wasn't 3.5 hours long. We then go back into Blackrock Mountain. We have BRD, and it's one of the biggest, no, it is actually the biggest dungeon ever made. It is ginormous. In fact, Molten Core itself was a wing of Blackrock Depths initially. It was not a raid. It was turned into a raid because they had to delay Blackwing Lair. Now, like I said, Blackrock Mountain was huge. 2 raids, essentially 4 dungeons, but technically 2 dungeon instances. And then in Cataclysm, they revamped it and added more things, yada yada yada. But in Classic, the original idea behind Blackrock Mountain was this massive interconnected super city, super state that was meant to be packed full of content for multiple phases. In fact, behind Baelgar, behind the Dark Iron Highways Gate, was likely meant to be another wing of Blackrock Depths. There are quests pointing towards opening and going in there, but again, the devs ran out of time, and one of the focus of the devs was always going forward and not really looking back. That's why we got TBC and then Wrath of the Lich King instead of finishing off Azeroth and the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor. So let's talk OG ideas. One of the first things, and this one is a very old, very scrap plot point and doesn't actually exist, but the Dark Iron Highway was likely meant to connect not just towards Grimbatol, but also towards the Bronzebeards and Dun Morogh. We were likely meant to connect all 3 dwarven cities together with one ginormous highway. And this does make some sense lore-wise because you have the Hall of Thanes underneath Ironforge, and in there are sealed gates and doors, and that likely did lead to the underground Dwarven Empire of old. Now again, Blackrock Mountain was built after, not before, the Dwarven Civil War. But that doesn't mean that the dwarves didn't have interconnected highway during the era of the Anvilmars. Now, the reason I expect that this got scrapped was because it was a lot of work, it was a lot of effort to make all of this connect and feel good and feel like a well-done storyline. We know from right now that Grimbatol was meant to be just like Blackrock Mountain, another giga structure, multiple raids, multiple dungeons, just a big area. But just like that, this was all scrapped. Now keep in mind that if you look at the OG maps of the Eastern Kingdoms from the second Warcraft game and pre-alpha World of Warcraft, all 3 dwarven cities were very close to each other. Ironforge was literally right here, then you had Blackrock Mountain to the south, and then to the northeast you had Grimbatol. Now, all 3 city-states likely had a highway connecting them. But that story is not coming back, but it might for Classic Plus. And I kind of do hope they go that route, because I would love to discover more of the underground horrors, the things that are sealed away that the dwarves don't talk about. Because remember, the dwarves diggy dig. That's what they're really good at. Look at the War Within and what the Earthen have done. They dug a highway literally kilometers underground into places long forgotten and long unseen. So let's talk the first concept that I could think of that is very realistic for what is behind Baelgar. The very first one is very likely another raid or another dungeon wing that turned into another raid. Now, like I said at the beginning of the video, Blackrock Mountain was meant to be ginormous. Multiple dungeons, multiple raids. And we did get a lot of that, but so much of it is scrapped and forgotten about. There are multiple paths and doors and sections within the Blackrock Mountain ecosystem that could potentially lead to other places. What kind of raid or dungeon would this wing have been? It likely would have been some kind of military district or maybe another civilian district, because we already went to the throne room. We killed the leader of the Dark Ironforge. We killed the leader of the Dark Iron Dwarves, Thorathian. And then, you know, Moira and all that stuff happens, and then his son comes back in retail. A whole shebang. But the raid and dungeon itself likely would have been more dwarven themed. because we already have Ragnaros as a titan, but we have the elemental guarding the gate, which means that Ragnaros didn't want the dwarves going in that direction, or was Baelgar defending against what could have been coming from the other side of that gate. But as I did say, we know for a fact that they had plans to expand it. The gate was able to be open technically, you can go behind it and you can see things. Well, it's a blocked off wall, but you can see that the idea there was it was meant to be a portal connecting to something else, just like Molten Core connects to Blackrock Depths. And personally, I think this was meant to be an elemental raid. Not like Ragnaros where he's just hidden there inside the core regenerating his power, but more like the dwarves building a big structure, maybe to summon an old god or summon creations. Again, we know right now that in the lore, Ragnaros serves the old gods, and he hates it, but he serves it. He does what he has to. And we saw this in Cataclysm with the Twilight Highlands and the Firelands raid in Hyjal and all that stuff. Ragnaros and the elementals serve the old gods. So the dwarves having a whole area, maybe area of worship, an area of war, a citizen area where there's corrupted dwarves who have been infected by the elements or the void. Because even in the current lore, Grimbatol at the very depths of it has Xal'atath's blade, and Xal'atath herself was, quotation marks, technically the cause of the corruption of Grimbatol. Technically, adventurers go and get Xal'atath's blade, remove it from there, things happen, a priest holds it, and Xal'atath gets in the hands of the champion and legion, and then the lore from there is now retail. But I've talked on the concept of a raid or a dungeon, and that, like I said, is the realistic concept. That's likely what it was meant to be. But I want to talk more about right now the Dark Iron Highway as a connecting structure from Ironforge all the way to Grimbatol. Because in my opinion, the ultimate version, the ultimate discovery should have been the path to Grimbatol. There should be an alliance entrance inside Ironforge. You know, you can go down to the Hall of Thanes, there's a door you can open, it takes you to like a little hub area, and the Horde should have their own entrance somewhere else. I'm not sure where they'd put it. Just put it somewhere. There's plenty of locations that the Dark Iron Dwarves or the Anvilmar Dwarves could have built connections to this ancient highway. That should have been a connection to Grimbatol because, like I said, the Void. The Dark Iron Highway, if it was not an ancient highway built by the Anvilmars, should have been a new highway being built by the Dark Iron Dwarves at the behest and command of Ragnaros and the Old Gods connecting to Grimbatol. And like I said, there is plenty of lore reasons to support this. The dwarves are great builders. Like I said, they dig and they're really good at digging. They can craft ginormous mountains, structures, cities. They are masters of engineering. They are at the pinnacle of construction. They're just regular dwarves in every fantasy. Look at the shit dwarves build in any media you look at. And it would have made perfect sense that Baelgar was guarding the way to Grimbatol. There should have been another portal there that leads to the Dark Iron Highway. The Dark Iron Highway should have been its own dungeon instance, you know, maybe a dungeon pathway, like a long dungeon that just keeps trekking onwards and onwards. And then eventually at the end of that, it leads to a raid in Grimbatol, and it would have been a perfect connection and would have expanded the Dwarven lore and the Old God lore and the Elemental lore. Now, they would have had to bullshit some way for the Horde to be connected to this, because the Horde is mostly connected to Neltharion and the Old Horde, or the True Horde as they like to call it. So there are plenty of ways they could make this work. The Dragonmaw still control Grimbatol, and they could have been void corrupted at this point, which means the Horde now have to go and put down the Dark Iron Dwarves, the Dragonmaw, the True Horde, and keep having all these connections. So there are many ways for them to make the Alliance and the Horde connect story-wise and storyline ways into making everybody go towards the Dark Iron Highway and Grimbatol. And to be fair, Blizzard has essentially ignored Blackrock Mountains since Cataclysm. And even in Cataclysm, they didn't really touch it that much, aside from adding another raid for Neltharion and the Black Dragons, because they like Black Dragons a lot. Well, not really, they kind of fucked up Rathian storyline, but that's a different question. For Classic Plus, or a future version of retail, please go back and finish off these locations. We are going to Midnight in 12.0. Midnight should talk more, not just about the elves, but the Dwarven Empire of old, and the human empires of old. And they're clearly leading that direction with the Arathi in retail, the Arathi Empire, Underground, and Hellafall. So all that stuff does connect. But in Classic Plus, or the future of Classic, or whatever they do, they should keep on expanding in the Dark Iron Dwarves, the Dwarven Empire, and all that means for Classic and its future. Because honestly, BRD is one of the best designed raid locations and dungeon locations in the entirety of Warcraft's history. Molten Core, not so much, but Blackwing Lair, Upper and Lower Blackrock Spire, Blackrock Depths, immaculate design, incredibly well done, and just genuinely top tier content. And Blizzard needs to do more of that. We need more mega dungeons, mega raids, multi-dungeon mega location. And that is the mystery behind the Dark Iron Highway and Baelgar. It's not the perfect answer, but it's the best answer we have until Blizzard decides to get its head out of its ass and finish this OG storyline that they have left abandoned for 20 goddamn years. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you liked it. If you did, like and subscribe. If you hated it, subscribe and hate every single video. Be a dedicated hater. Thank you all, Ebonheart out.